My name is Judy Balint. I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1932. My maiden name is Kosai, K-O-S-A-L-Y. My father and mother were Marcel and Maria Kosai. They were very good parents, and I had a very happy childhood. We lived in an apartment like everybody in Europe at that time. Most middle-class people, that is. The change came when I was 11 years old and I wasn't able to go to a public high school. I had to go to a Jewish high school. And the second year I went to the high school, a very famous day, 1942, March 19th, and it was a Sunday. And I was at school because it being a Jewish high school. When the teachers told us to very quietly put our coats on and walk home without getting any attention from anybody. I was a very naive child. I went home and I had no idea why I had to go home. And only when I was home and I told my parents, that's when they started to listen to the English radio, and they realized what happened, that the Nazis came into Budapest. Our lives have changed. I couldn't continue going to school because it just stopped being a school anymore.
Did you notice anti-Semitism much before you stopped going to school?
I was a pretty protected child. I was aware of it. Even in elementary school, I knew that there was a teacher who didn't like Jewish girls. But basically, we had religious teachings in public school. There was no Sunday school, so all the religion I learned was in public school at the religious classes. When that came, then all the girls parted. Some of them were Catholics, some of them were Protestants, some of them were Jewish, and then we just parted in 3 different other classes to have our own religion classes. Jews were very adopted. They were Hungarians first. Jewishness was a religion, not a nationality. And we were just like anybody else. I was taught by my parents that I am a Hungarian girl. And it was later on when I realized that actually I was a Jewish girl, not a Hungarian girl in everybody else's eyes who wasn't Jewish.
Was your family very religious?
My grandparents were. They were not, they were Orthodox, but they were, they looked like everybody else. They didn't, my grandfather didn't wear a payet. He did wear a kippah though, all the time. And they were kosher. My parents, we weren't even kosher.
Did you belong to a temple or?
Well, you go to any temple, you pay taxes to the Jewish, I don't think it was called Jewish Federation, but there was this Jewish organization that all the temples belonged to, and everybody who was Jewish paid taxes there, and that's how the rabbis, cantors got paid. And of course, if somebody had a wedding, that would be their extra payment. And you just went to the temple that was closest to where you lived. And my grandfather was important at the temple. He always sat up in the bima. And my grandmother was very active in the sisterhood. And this is my grandparents on my mother's side. My other grandparents, who lived a little bit farther, they went to a different congregation, and I usually visited them at the temple during high holidays. I had very good memories of Hanukkah and Seders. My father sang with me every night during lighting the Hanukkah candles. And my grandparents had Seder. We spent one night at one grandparent house and the next night at the other grandparent house. So it was a very ideal Jewish family.
Nice.
When the Nazis came, after a short while, my father had to go to a forced labor camp. And
what year would that have been?
That was in 1944.
Oh,
I said before 1942, but I was wrong. It's 1944 when all this happened. It was 1944. First, what my father tried, he went to work in a small factory that one of our friends had, thinking that if he works in a factory, he will be exempt of going to a labor camp. But it didn't help, and he did have to go to the labor camp anyway.
Did they set up a ghetto in your town?
They did. And we have been at the ghetto the last 3 or 4 weeks of the Nazis being there. So our life during the Nazism was relatively short compared to all the other European countries, because the Nazis came in 1944, and 45 the Russians came in and beat the Nazis. And that was during when we were in the ghetto. We had to wear a yellow star, and certain houses were designated as Jewish houses, which meant that they put a yellow star on the entrance door, so to know that this is a Jewish house, it's contaminated. And later on, they were trying to collect all the young women also.
This is the Germans, not the Russians, right?
These were the Hungarians, actually.
Oh.
The Hungarians are very opportunistic. And they were, of course, all for hating Jews.
Yeah.
And they became more Nazi than the Nazis themselves. And they were collecting all healthy younger women. Like my mother was very young at the time. She was 30, maybe 29 or 30 years old only. And all the women left, and there was a designated place they had to go. But my mother showed up in the evening, and she said that they never got to her name. And they told her to go back next day, which she refused. My girlfriend's mother, who did go, she was deported, but she did survive. We never learned what happened to her because she never ever talked about it.
Uh-huh.
She lived till 95.
Oh.
But my mother came back, which was wonderful, because eventually, after my father escaped once from the wagon, they were all inside the wagon at a railroad station.
Were the wagons pulled by horses?
No, this
What kind of
this was the railway wagons. What they were shipping the The
Cattle? They're like cattle cars.
Cattle cars.
Oh,
yes.
okay.
Well, we
They
called
got
them
mixed
wagons,
up.
but yes, they were cattle cars.
Okay.
And this particular cattle car did not have bars on their window. It was like a small window, but they didn't have any bars, so somebody thought of it, but maybe they can push people out
Through the
through
opening?
the opening.
Wow.
And this is how my father escaped.
Wow.
I don't know how many people left before him, but the one after him got shot.
Did he escape, or
Yes.
do you know if he climbed out when
He
the
climbed.
train was moving?
No, it was still standing in the station. And so he was still in Budapest, and he came home, which was a pretty dangerous thing because it was curfew for Jews, and it was dark, and he literally had to go from door to door of this apartment houses until he got home. And this was not a very long journey, but it was about 3 miles, I would say, by the time he got home. Second time he arrived, he escaped, was when he was again at the railroad station. And at that time, it wasn't, you could save yourself by either obtaining a Swiss citizenship paper or a Swedish one. The Swedish one was through Wallenberg, was of course better because after a while the Swiss papers were not good enough. And before they were put in the cattle cars, they were asking who had Swedish papers. And my father didn't, but he knew somebody who did. So he said, I'm going to tell his name, which was also dangerous because the guy before him had to tell what his mother's name was, and my father had no idea what this guy's mother's name is. But it got really late. So by the time they got to him, they didn't even ask the mother's name. So he was just lucky. And this was very unusual for my father. He was not a hero type. He was a very retired person who didn't want to be noticed.
What was his profession?
He was a food broker, more or less. He was a connection between the farmers and the canneries.
Good job.
And he was involved in the grain exchange because he started out like in grains only, and later only he went into the other food business also. His office was at home. Since my father escaped, we were lucky enough, we were together to the end. And
so everyone...
we were, yes, but it didn't mean that we lived alone in an apartment. There were lots of people living in the apartment.
This was not your home.
Well, the Jewish house was actually where we lived. It was designated Jewish house, but we moved together with people that we knew in that house into a bigger apartment. And then after a while, it wasn't safe anymore, so we obtained Swiss papers and we moved to the next door apartment house and again moved together. There was 44 of us living in a 3-room apartment.
Wow.
When you wanted to go to the bathroom at night, you had to wake up 4 people to be able to open the door. My mother was a phenomenal housekeeper. She was an obsessed housekeeper.
Did you take after her?
No, my sister more than I do. When we lived in this place with 44 people, we had about maybe 3 or 4 square feet that we could call our own home on the floor. And my mother was waxing that floor and shining it, and just that one space was always perfect and clean, and it had to be just so.
Did you have blankets and...
Oh yes, we could take our blankets and pillows and all this, but everything had to look like a home. It was the same thing after when we had to move to the ghetto. We had to walk to the ghetto from this house. The whole house walked.
Was that not part of the ghetto?
No, it wasn't. It was the designated ghetto was the area where the Orthodox Jews lived, the ones who wore the kaftan and the hats and the payet and
Very Orthodox.
Very Orthodox.
Yeah.
I unfortunately was brought up not liking these people, and I still don't. You know, but something you grow up with, you can't change. We had nothing to do with these people. We didn't even speak Yiddish. I still don't.
Oh. What languages did you speak at that time?
Hungarian and German. In school, I learned German even as a very small child. I had nannies who taught us German and made us speak German. My grandparents spoke German. They spoke Yiddish too, I think, but they never said anything, except for a few words. They never talked to us in Yiddish.
Was your mother's mother?
My mother,
grandmother.
I don't even know if she spoke any Yiddish at all. This was my father. On my father's side, they did speak.
Family.
Yes. Yeah. And my mother, that was a separate story. She was adopted by her mother's sister and husband because her father died when she was quite young, around 6 maybe, and she had a brother, and her mother couldn't possibly care for the 2 children.
What happened to the brother?
He also was lost. My mother's family, except for some cousins, nobody survived. It was my father.
Killed by the Germans?
Yes, I don't know, because
could be the
her mother, whom I knew, her real mother, lived in Sarajevo. So I really don't know what happened to those Jews. I just know that after the war, we just didn't have these people anymore. And my mother's brother was probably taken in 1942 with my other uncle of my father's brothers, who never came back. They were taken to Siberia, to forced labor camps and whatever, wherever the Germans took some people, I don't know, not Siberia, but somewhere in Russia. When we walked to the ghetto, my memories are that it's the first time I ever saw a dead body.
Oh.
And they weren't Jewish bodies, it was air raids. And as...
Oh, from bombings?
From bombings, yes. And there were just people laying on the street and dead horses and...
blood, you must have seen blood.
Probably, yes. Well, it wasn't so much, it's just... They wouldn't let me, even if somebody died in our family, we wouldn't be there. Because they didn't take children to view bodies. I don't think that was a Jewish thing to do at all.
Yeah.
Anyway, we went to the ghetto, which was about 2 miles from where we lived. We walked there. We picked up whatever we could take in our hands because there weren't any carts or anything. My mother picked up a about maybe a 2-gallon can of goose lard.
Of what?
Goose lard.
Oh, goose lard.
She
That was
took
probably
that.
precious stuff.
Oh, yes. And whatever we thought, she thought that was calories, and if we had nothing to eat, it will keep us alive. And then, of course, we each had a backpack with blankets and pillows and whatever. And there
This
was
is when you were going into the ghetto?
walking into the ghetto.
Yeah.
And we kind of held together 12 or 13 people.
Did you know that you were leaving the apartment? And
Oh, yes.
that-
Oh, yes.
that
Well, I was 12 years old. I knew what was going on. And
you knew you were going into the ghetto to stay
oh,
there.
yeah. Well, yes, we hoped. We hoped we were going to the ghetto and not to anywhere else we didn't want to
That
go.
was worse, yeah.
And they told us that we had to go to a certain apartment house. And we should just go down in the basement, which is the air raid shelter. And we went there, and we were lucky enough that the first floor of that apartment house was a police office. It used to be a police office. So we decided we don't want to go to the air raid shelter. We are going to stay in this offices. In fact, we had this one room. There was nothing in that one room except this one long green table and maybe a couple of chairs. Somehow, I think from the Jewish Institute, we did get a little a little wooden stove. I don't remember if it was there or we received it. Anyway, that's what we heated in, and if there was anything to eat, we cooked it on there. There was only the floor, and there were about 1.5 feet marked on the wall. That would be our sleeping space, so we all fit.
Wow.
I have to say that it sounds horrible, and it was in many ways. But every time I think about it, I'm smiling because we were singing and telling jokes. And when we were hungry, we were telling recipes to each other. We spent the day scavenging for anything that we can burn in the stove. One day, we obtained a whole two sacks full of toothpicks. We were heating with toothpicks for 2 days.
Not very tasty.
We didn't eat it. We were heating with it. And once a friend of ours who used to live in the same apartment house and now he lived in a different house, he came over and asked us if he can cook himself a soup on the stove. So, yes, we said yes. So he brought a cup of flour, and each one of us that went by stole 1 spoonful of flour from him. And at the end, he said, "Oh, this is not enough to take home. You can keep the flour." So we were just absolutely happy. So we can make a soup for ourselves too. And the last day was very remarkable because
Right now,
the last day was very remarkable when it got a little bit dark. Then the shooting started. We had no idea who is shooting at whom, but there was somebody in our doorway to the apartment house, and there was somebody else across the street at the doorway.
This
And they
was
were
in the
shooting.
ghetto.
They were shooting at each other. So one was Russian, one was German, and they were street fighting. Until finally the Russians came in. But I'm ahead of myself because I want to make sure that everybody knows that next door, in the next apartment building, just the day before, 2 or 3 young punks, 12 to 14 years old, machine gunned down the whole, all the people in that house. So my father and a few men in our room.
Hungarian boys?
Yes. My father and the man in our room went around and found some shovels, and I don't know if they could find axes, but anything that they thought they can fight with, because they decided if these kids come in, they are going to take out at least 1 or 2 before they can kill us.
Yeah.
And only after this day was the fight between the Russian and the German. Then the Russians came in. And they have to finish with that because one of the men spoke Russian and taught all the others to say "kleba" for bread, because we didn't have bread for weeks, and a couple of other Russian words, and that we are Jewish and we are not the enemy. Unfortunately for these Russians who came into our house, we were the enemy. They were down in the air raid shelter in the basement. My father went down, and he had this one little dynamo light that he had to keep on squeezing to have light. The Russian looks at him, and my father said that he is Jewish and we need bread. He takes away his lamp, he takes his watch away and hits him over the head. This was our introduction to the Russians.
Wow.
Later that day, my uncle came, picked us up, and we walked home, seeing the ruins of Budapest after a lot of bombing and houses burning. And we went home to our apartment, which was pretty much ransacked by the goyim in the house.
Your original apartment, huh? Your original apartment. Your
Our
home. Your home.
real, yeah, our original, yes.
Your father survived being hit.
Well, my father was, he wasn't hit. I mean, he was hit over the head, yes. Yes, he survived it. He survived a lot of things. My father lived until he was 90 years old. He died 2 weeks before his birthday.
Oh my God. He lived here in this country?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. They came here, my parents. My mother was 50, my father was 62. They worked for many years. And yes, they survived and they were here. They were only interested in being with their children. They were not interested in staying with their friends in Hungary.
Which is natural, it's good.
Yes. Yeah. And this is, the rest of the story would not be about survivors. It was okay. Just the Russian story.
So the ones that liberated you were Russians? Did you say that?
Well, no. We were Hungarians still.
You were Hungarian?
And for a while, the communists work interesting ways. They start out that nothing is going to change, everything is going to be just better. And for a few years, it was much better until the Russians noticed that we have it too good.
Oh.
And pretty soon, there was less and less allowed. They took away private properties. Like my grandfather had a boys' apparel shop, and my uncle worked there. And
This in Budapest?
In Budapest.
Yeah.
And that was taken by the Russians. And
so the Germans were out of the picture at that time?
By then they were out of the picture, yes. And the Russians also exiled my parents from Budapest to the country, took away again everything from them. They lived in the country for a year and a half, my 16-year-old sister too. I didn't because I got married a day before. And they never ever had their own apartment. They always lived in somebody else's until they came here.
Your parents?
My parents,
Yeah.
yes.
So what year did they come here?
Wait a minute. I came in 1956, and they came 6 years later, 1972.
And they left from what town?
From Budapest.
From
they
Budapest?
left, yes,
And they
but they
flew here.
came legally. They came legally, yes.
And how about you, when you came?
Oh, I fled. I fled in 1956. Somebody told me, I worked in
From
a
Budapest?
clinic, yes.
Yeah.
I worked in a clinic, and somebody told me that the borders are open. And I telephoned, at that time I had a boyfriend, and I telephoned him that would he want to go. And he came, and then another couple friends of his, actually just one friend, and we were hitchhiking to the border, where we
With
got...
you were hitchhiking?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And, well, my poor parents thought that I had a sure trip because they would have been too worried. I said, don't worry.
So they were worried. They
Yes,
knew. They
yes.
knew that you were.
Of
fleeing.
course, I
Yeah.
told them that I'm leaving next day. And yes, we got on a truck, and we thought that we are free going out of the country, except at the borders there was still somebody there asking questions. So they turned us back, and we stayed in that border town overnight, and next morning we heard that the Russians are in Budapest. And even though the two guys wanted to come back, I said, you can go back, I'm not. If I die anywhere, I will die at the border, not in Budapest. So they came with me, and I asked, how do I get through the border? And they told me that there is a dry riverbed. And so we walked to the dry riverbed, and we were tiptoeing there so nobody can hear us. Suddenly we hear this real big noise and laughing and barking and kids. And we look out, and whole towns are moving with their horses, cows, and children through the border.
Oh,
So we
wow.
didn't need to tiptoe anymore.
So you joined
But
them.
no, we didn't. We kept at our pace. And somewhere we lost them. And suddenly we saw this green area, and I looked, I said, there are little flags, red, white, and red, and I think those are Austrian flags. So there was this guy over on the other side, and I got my memory of my German and asked him if this is Austria, and he said yes. So we went through, and I can't tell you how tense it was, because the border is not a straight line. It goes zigzag, and
yeah.
I didn't want to put a single foot back into Hungary. And we walked until we saw a railroad.
Station or track?
It wasn't tracks, railroad tracks. And we thought, well, sooner or later we'll find a station, and we did. And I didn't have any money, of course, especially not Austrian. The guys had some Hungarian money. But I did have a silver cigarette case. And I went to the window and I said, would you take this for 3 tickets to Vienna?
Oh.
And the lady looked at me and she said, do you have Hungarian money? I take it. So we paid in Hungarian money, and we waited, I don't know how long, for a train, and it came, and it took us to Vienna, where I got a cab, and I went to the friends I knew there,
Oh.
and I rang the bell and told them to pay for the cab. And they were the ones who got us there, a temporary apartment and a job. We all had jobs. We stayed 6 weeks in Austria. We kept on going to the American embassy until we were able to come to this country, which was my...
You came by ship or plane?
No, plane.
And you landed where in America?
At Camp Kilmer. We went to Camp Kilmer. There was no more Ellis Island when I arrived.
Oh.
So they processed us in Camp Kilmer. And we were there for, I don't know, maybe a week or two, and maybe less, because I could call my friends in Florida, my mother's best friend, who is still alive, bless her heart, and we could go to their house in Hollywood.
Florida.
Hollywood, Florida, and I did get a job there as a housekeeper.
Right.
My sister wasn't with me. She came a little bit later, and so she arrived later to Florida.
Oh. But your mother and father were still
they were in
there.
Hungary. We had to be in United States citizens before we could do anything about them coming here. And they didn't want to escape. I don't think my father could have gone through that. So they just wanted to come the legal way, so we became citizens. And
so they were patient and waited for it to
yes, well, they were both working, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so you were all together in America, in New York?
No, Milwaukee. We lived in Milwaukee. We all came from Hollywood. We went to Milwaukee because this friend of ours, whose sister I went to in Vienna, worked in Milwaukee and asked if my husband, who was also an engineer, would come to Milwaukee.
Oh.
And so we all, and then by then my sister was with us, so the three of us went up to Milwaukee on a train because I was so sick on an airplane that on the airplane I didn't want to take an airplane anymore. That changed.
Yeah. Yeah, but since then you've taken
yes.
rides.
Yeah. So
anyway, you were together, your original family together in
Milwaukee, yes. In fact, by the time my parents came, I was divorced and remarried already. To my husband, I lived with 40 years after that.
You were married in Budapest?
In Vienna.
Or in Vienna. Oh.
And I was married about 4.5 years. And I had one child by him. And then when I divorced, I remarried. That husband had 2 children. That's why I have 3.
Oh,
I never talk about stepchildren. They are not. They are like real children.
That's wonderful. So when you married the second time, that was in America?
Yes, in Milwaukee, yes.
And that's where you met your husband?
Yeah, yes.
For 40 years, that worked out?
Yes, yes. Oh, he was perfect.
Okay, then from there, from Milwaukee, you were working and you're...
And I hated cold weather. I didn't like it as a child, so I hated it more as I got older. And my husband promised me when he retires, we'll go somewhere warm. And we checked out a lot of places, and we decided we wanted to live in Arizona.
In where?
In Arizona.
Oh, in Arizona, yes.
So we came with a trailer. We lived 8 months in a trailer, and then bought a house in Sun City West, and I'm still living in it.
That's wonderful. I guess that's the end of the story.
Yes.
I think you did a great job. I think we will stop it here. I can't think.
Okay. Just one more thing about the Russians. My sister was very, very scared through the ghetto years and through the ghetto months and even afterwards. But in spite of what happened to my father, we were pretty welcoming to the Russians because we thought that they really saved our lives by coming and beating the Germans. One morning in our apartment, my sister was still in bed. I don't know if she was sick or why. 2 Russians came in.
They didn't knock, huh? They just
Oh, they knocked. Maybe they knocked. I don't know. No, it was one Russian actually that came in and behaved very friendly, and we were very friendly to him. I was 12 years old. You have to think about that. It was winter. I don't know where I was. I came home and I had a babushka on my face, on my head, and whatever. And this Russian looks around in the bedroom. This was actually one of our rooms, okay? And looks at pictures. I had some pictures on the wall when I was 2 or 4 years old, and looks at these pictures, and my parents tried to explain it to him that that picture is me. And in the meantime, the neighbor came in who also understood enough Russians. And the Russian smile at everything and keeps on pointing at the picture, and we are smiling and everything. Suddenly, this neighbor tells us in Hungarian, sort of aside, that take the girl away, he wants her. He wants the girl, and that girl was me. So I don't know how they kept him busy, but behind his back I sneaked out of the room. I went down to the super's apartment, where somebody brought me boys' clothes and a bandage where my long hair was bandaged on my face, and I looked like I was in an accident.
Oh.
And a boy's cap and everything. So I was sitting there in case they are looking for me. Well, they said that he was threatening my father if he did not produce me, but luckily he didn't shoot him.
Wow.
I just wanted to put this in. And about shooting, I did have one friend, a young man, whose father did not come. Yeah, he wasn't back yet after the war. And he was with his mother in bed when a Russian came into their room and looking for guns. And they said, we don't have any guns. And they went and shot down his mother next to him in bed. Yes.
And not him?
No.
They just killed the mother?
Yes.
What a terrible story. Terrible.
This stupid guy became a communist. I can't believe it.
Who?
The one whose mother was shot by the Russian.
Oh my gosh, that's a surprise.
Yes. Anyway, this just came into my mind. It's just something
Okay.
that I sometimes think about.
You got any other thoughts that
Well, I can think of my favorite aunt who had cancer. And she was operated on during the Nazism, but they sewed her back together because they said they couldn't, it was not operable. She was alive until after we came back from the ghetto. She was not taken to the ghetto. And my aunt died. And I couldn't go to the cemetery when it had to be walked to the cemetery on a little push cart because there was no car or anything at that time yet. And the whole family walked her out to the cemetery. I couldn't go because my shoes did not have sole on it. And before my aunt died, her last sentence was, "Don't forget to buy Judy shoes." There weren't even any stores to get any shoes.
Oh, wow. That's something you remember.
Yes, yes.